Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Hi, welcome to Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers. I'm Bruce Southworth, mystery reviewer for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. My guests today are Mary Logue and Pete Hautman, two very prolific local writers, award-winning writers. Excuse me, Mary has been an editor, an anthologist, a translator, and a teacher at Hamline University. Her first mystery was published in 1987, Red Lake of the Heart, following with Still Explosion in 1993. She's written many volumes of poetry and young adult and children's books, and her most recent series is being published by Walker. It began with Blood Country and continues with Dark COULEE and Glare Ice, which was just published October 2001, this month. And Pete, his background's in graphic arts and was a marketing consultant for a time and a fruit slicer at the Minnesota State Fair, I dug up. His first mystery was Drawing Dead in 1993, followed by Short Money, Mortal Nuts, Ring Game, and most recently Ragman, published October 2001. Also a very prolific writer of young adult and children's books. I want to thank you both for coming very much. This is going to be wide-ranging, I think.
Great to be here.
Good, thanks. Let's just start with one basic thing, just to kind of put the context together. How did you two come to meet, and what were the circumstances around that?
We met in 1989. I was considering a career change from my previous business type background into writing, mostly because I got fired. And one of my first steps was to sign up for a class at the Loft, a local writing organization. And so I went and I looked at the various classes that were offered. I read work by some of the people that were teaching the classes, and I read Mary's work, and I said, that's a class that I've definitely got to check out. So I signed up for her suspense writing class.
So he was my student.
He was your student.
Yeah.
The teacher's pet, I read in one article, as it was described.
Yeah.
And what kind of a student was he?
Well, you know, that's a very good question. I was very nervous because he walked in his cowboy boots, and I thought he was pretty cute. And it wasn't until the third or fourth class that he read, and I was nervous that, you know, I wanted him to be a good writer. And I remember the first line that he read in class. The main character starts out, "People are animals," and proceeded to read from Mortal Nuts.
Early version of the Mortal Nuts.
Yeah, which actually didn't come out until a few books into his career, but I was pretty knocked out by what I heard. So so that began.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as you live and work together, how are you the same, or how do you differ when you approach a book, when you're kind of planning or plotting it? Do you start from the beginning and go straight to the end? Do you outline, talk to authors who say, no, I have to start at the end and work backwards? And how do you approach it?
Well, I approach it by first creating characters and situations and writing scenes. And eventually those scenes will turn into a first chapter, and maybe a second chapter, maybe a third chapter, at which point I start to suspect that I have something that might be a book. And then I try to write an outline. And I write an outline, usually a 2 or 3 page outline. And then I continue with the book and often never refer to the outline again I just kind of follow where it goes.
I've heard they often go out the window as,
Yeah.
as things progress.
But it gives you the illusion that you know where you're going. You know, it's like looking at a map when you're completely lost. You know, you don't know where you are on the map, so it isn't doing you any good, but you feel like you're doing the right thing.
Or you open the hood of the car and look in like
Yeah, your car's broke down, you open the hood and look at it, you go,
And nod knowingly and say, I can identify one or two of those things, but I have no idea. How about you?
Well, I differ in a couple of ways, not, I don't think intrinsically, but by the very nature that I'm writing a series now, and I think there's something quite different in writing a series, because I have the characters established for the most part. You know, certainly characters come in each book that are new, but one of the things I'm conscious of with the series is that that Claire has moved, my main character, Claire Watkins, has moved down to a small town, and that with each book in the series, her integration, if you will, into the community, into the kind of heart of this small town grows, and the depth of her understanding of the people, and so the way that I come at, I mean, I'm really seeing that this, as the series grows, that I'm kind of engaging more deeply in what it means to live in a small town and to be a deputy sheriff, and to have Claire realize that these are people that she cares about and knows about, and it's quite a different way of policing than she was used to in the Twin Cities. But the other thing I'd like to say about the way I come at my writing is that I usually live with a book for about a year before I write a word down. That almost always, when I'm writing a book, as I'm writing that book, the next book has come into my consciousness in my head, and I often feel like my head is a sieve, and that the good stuff that I think about this upcoming book stays in my head, but the bad stuff kind of filters away, and so that by the time this year is over and I'm ready to sit down and start to outline very loosely, I have a pretty good sense of certainly the atmosphere of the book, some of the main scenes in the book, and often really interesting little details that are what kind of keep me going. I have found that I don't, I have done that thing of outlining a whole book, you know, chapter by chapter by chapter, and then what I came to see after I did that a few books was that about every fourth chapter I would have to totally revamp. So now I just outline about 4 or 5 chapters ahead of where I am, and that has worked much more successfully for me.
But one thing I want to say about that, I think you do and I do, I think we always know where the book is going ultimately. In other words, we create these situations, and we know mostly how they're going to be resolved. The getting there is a bit more of an art.
You use the computer a little bit too. I mean, you've done those kind of layered outlines.
For outlining, and it hasn't been all that useful.
Technology wins out again.
Well, in these books, and well, I'll just speak for myself. In my books, I usually have a very serious theme that I'm exploring. There's something going on. There's some aspect of life that I really want to look at, and how it impacts characters and so forth. But that really doesn't have much to do with the story. You know, so the theme is there all along, and then the creating of the outline and the writing of the chapters. It's like there's a big sense of direction, but I never know what's going to happen next.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean?
I see. Well, when you have your theme, this leads me in an interesting direction too. You have your theme, that serious focus, but you're often known as a writer with quirky characters, a lot of humor. Do you try to advance what you're talking about in the theme, you know, consciously, to try and make, you know, those humorous aspects make the story flow?
Well, my nature is to use humor as a way of sort of getting through life. There are very, very few things that I don't joke about on some level, and it's a way of exploring and diffusing the things that life throws at us.
But you were saying the other day that I read something and you didn't think it was funny, and I thought it was.
When I wrote Ragman, I showed Mary when the book was partway along, and I said to her, gee, I think I've written a book that's not funny. And I said, this is much more serious than my other books, and it is a bit more serious, but I thought I'd written kind of this humorless book. And I showed it to Mary, and Mary's, looking through the manuscript, and she's giggling and laughing. I go, what's so funny? And she says, well, this scene is funny, and this scene is funny. And I look at it, and I go, well, gosh, that's right. Well, that is pretty funny. But because of the nature of the humor in Ragman and in my other books, it's what I call banana peel humor. And it's funny if you're watching it happen to someone else. Mm-hmm. But if it's happening to you, it's very not funny. And when I'm writing, I'm in character. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm writing from the point of view of the characters that these things are happening to, and I go, this is not funny at all. But someone standing on the sidewalk watching, they find it very amusing.
Different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Well, by the same token, I think virtually every review of your books that I've read, and even those I've written, you've been noted for a very poetic use of language and a very great attention to detail, and especially in the series, the Claire Watkins series, the detail of small town life and so on. Is that kind of a similar function in the books?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think it might be. I'd never thought of it that way. I think that I depend on a poetic construct for energy, if that makes sense. That I often, scenes come to me out of image. So that when I think of the way I'm going to end the book, I often want to leave the reader with a last image. When I open a book, I want to open the book with the image, like in Glare Ice, of the lake beginning to freeze over. There's a lot of visuals about the kind of the frosty lace that lines the banks of the lake, and I'm so conscious of trying to place my reader in a world that I think the best way, often the best way to do that is with the detail that really brings them right there, and kind of. So even in conversation, I think even sometimes in the things my people say to each other, I'm really conscious of the sound of the language in the line break, and
You mentioned, I guess, you're reading Pete's books and so on. Do you do much commentary or editing or of each other's work?
A lot of commentary, a little bit of editing, because, well, we have editors, that are paid to do that. But we do read all of each other's work, and we talk about the books as they develop.
Right.
We do a lot of that, and that's tremendously helpful for me, I know. We also do a lot of helping each other with points of view, because we both write from multiple points of view. A lot of times I'm writing from a woman's point of view, and Mary's writing from a man's point of view. And I have to be there to tell Mary to identify the kind of car that the guy's driving, because he's thinking about it. And she has to tell me that if I'm in a woman's point of view, I have to notice what people are wearing, and what kind of dress someone has on, and so forth. I mean, those are very mundane examples, but but it's like, well, I don't think a woman would see this scene this way, or I don't think a guy would see this in this way.
Would you mention what she's feeling, or just that different point of view? I think I agree with Peter. We don't tend to do line edit stuff very much to each other. I also think that we tend to hold off sometimes. We're pretty conscious that, or at least I'm conscious, that you can only use someone as that really good editor so often. I mean, in other words, so I'll often go fairly far into a book before I'll show it to Peter, because I know that that's almost the only time he's going to be able to see that part of the book with that kind of sweep.
It's tough to read a book for the third time and
have clarity with it.
It's like when you're reading the same thing over again, you tend not to read stuff that's not new, and so you don't feel the book the way a first-time reader is going to feel it.
And so we kind of try to save each other a little bit, because Peter's probably my best reader, and I don't want to use him until it's, I really need that. But yeah, I would say we always read each other's stuff.
This sounds like a great working collaboration.
It helps a great deal that we had this kind of relationship before we started having a more intimate relationship. In other words, we were reading each other's work and commenting on it before we started dating. Because I talk to a lot of people that they have a relationship and then they start showing each other their work, and it's much more loaded.
I would think it would be tougher, or potentially tougher, to give an honest opinion back and forth with.
The other thing that's interesting is that that we both write. I mean, Peter writes more, I would say, crime, caper, fiction. Not so classic mystery. I write a slightly more classic mystery, but then we also both write, young adult stuff and kids' books, and so he doesn't write poetry, and I don't tend to write poker books.
There's some areas that are off limits. Okay.
Right.
Well, actually, I do want to get into talking about the books, but you brought up the young adult and the children's books. Now, Pete, in your early career, I mean, you've done a lot of nonfiction children's books, something like 50 of them under a pseudonym for a local company. You've done several children biographies, and both some young adult fiction works. And I was curious as to where the commitment to that kind of thing came from, especially for you both. It's interesting to see that you both do that.
Well, the young adult fiction, I have 3 young adult novels. The latest one is an adventure set in the Grand Canyon called Hole in the Sky. When I have an idea for a story, and I've got a lot of ideas floating around that might turn into books, one of the first things that has to happen to turn it into a book is you have to decide who's telling the story. And sometimes a story is best told from the point of view of a younger person, because they see the world in very different, very fresh ways. And those 3 particular books, I decided that the best way to tell the story was to have a younger protagonist, a teenage protagonist. And so I wrote the books. Now, from then on, it's a marketing decision. It's who will publish this book and for what audience will they read it. Well, adults tend to be less likely to want to read books from the point of view of a teenager, but teenagers are very interested in that. Hence the young adult books.
Right.
As far as the nonfiction books, that's something that I enjoy doing. I like writing for younger kids. I like doing the research, and I continue to do it.
Got an example of one of them that you have done here.
One of the first, Porcupines.
Porcupines, yeah. That actually you were kind enough to give to my daughter, and as I mentioned earlier, I had to get permission to borrow this again.
Right.
One of the things, I did have to take the chapter about porcupine mating practices out of that book because it was
Too prickly?
too violent.
Now, your most recent, I think, young adult novel was Dancing with an Alien,
Yeah.
Which I also have, and I had to get permission to use. I'll put that here. This is a very interesting story because it is truly sort of coming-of-age science fiction combination.
Yeah.
Now, where did you get the idea for this?
Well, it's so bizarre. Have I told you? I
think I may have heard a bit of it.
Yeah, I was driving from the Twin Cities down to the house we have in Stockholm, Wisconsin. It's about an hour and a half drive, and so of course I get a little peckish about halfway down and have to stop off at the bakery in Prescott, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. Anyways, I walked into the bakery to get a donut, and these 2 teenagers were talking to each other, and the boy said to the girl, "Well, it was like dancing with an alien." And I walked out with my donut and the title of the book. And Peter had written at least Mr. Was by then, and maybe was starting on Stone Cold, but I had no intention of writing a young adult book. But by the time I got to Stockholm 45 minutes later, I had the whole book in my head. It just rolled out in front of me. And I came home and I said to him, I have this idea for a young adult book. And he said, go for it. And in like 3 months, I wrote Dancing. And it was a blast. It was so much fun. I have had. What's also interesting, we've noticed this, is that my mysteries, my adult books are very darkish and serious. And there's a little humor, but it's kind of just very lightly sprinkled. where my young adult stuff tends to be a little funnier. And Peter's the opposite. His adult stuff is quite funny, very funny, and his young adult stuff is very dark. I think much darker than, and I don't know why. I mean, it's very odd that we would flip that way. Maybe it's the way we saw our childhoods or something.
You mentioned Mr. Was. I was just curious. Were you sort of surprised at the Edgar nomination for that book as opposed to your adult fiction?
Yeah, I was. I hadn't thought of it as a mystery at all, but I guess there was a mystery in it, and caught someone's attention. I was delighted.
Yeah, it's a great honor, even the nomination. Let's try and get up to date here a little bit on the adult fiction. Your series, starting with Blood Country, Dark COULEE, and then Glare Ice, features Claire Watkins, who is a former policewoman from St. Paul, right?
Right.
And she has moved to not southeastern Minnesota, but just over the border into Wisconsin.
Right.
What was the genesis for that series or that character?
Well, a couple things. I had bought a house down in Stockholm, Wisconsin, which is a little town of about I think we're up to 97 people now. And I was growing up in the Twin Cities, it was such an incredible change for me to be down in such a small town. And I loved it. I'm very much of an extrovert. I really love people, and I love the community down there. And I really wanted to take that as a setting, and I love the area. I think it's beautiful. But I didn't want to write a Murder, She Wrote type of thing, a cozy where someone happens across a body. Those don't interest me as much. I really write more than a whodunit. I write a why did it happen. I mean, I wanted a character that could both have just moved down so that she could really kind of feel some of the things that I had noticed about the incredible difference, and also someone who would have a legitimate reason to be finding bodies.
Yeah, although I would say I think it's the first book, is the daughter that actually comes across the body
That's right.
in the garden, so there's a sort of a stumbling over a body there.
Right, yes.
What I find interesting in the books is also that the sense that the same kinds of things essentially that she's escaping from in St. Paul, the same attitudes, the same frailties in people exist even in a small town.
Right.
So.
And in some ways they're intensified because she ends up with the whole picture around her. I mean, this whole sense of, it's not as removed as it is in a big city.
Yeah, there's more context to put the investigation in.
Right.
Ragman, your most recent, a wonderful book. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
But it is not a mystery, really, and I've heard it referred to as your breakout book, which I hope is the case. But it's what I guess, since there is a crime in it of sorts, I wanted to know if you were thinking about the kind of looking at crime or that kind of action at a higher altitude as opposed to closer as a traditional mystery would.
Well, one thing that I think about from time to time, it's one of my personal fears is going to jail. The idea of being imprisoned is terrifying to me. And because I'm afraid of it, I've thought of all kinds of ways that I could get there. And it's quite possible in this world for a good person who leads a law-abiding life to run into a set of circumstances that turns them into a criminal. It happens every day. A man comes home from work early and finds his wife in bed with another man and snaps. A driver isn't paying attention in an irresponsible way, as we all do from time to time, and there happens to be a child in the street where that happens. Negligent homicide. Someone suddenly finds himself with a financial crisis of such severity that they do something they could never have imagined themselves doing. And so with Ragman, I wanted to explore what happens when a good person becomes a criminal. How does it change them? Were they always a criminal that just hadn't committed a crime yet? Or were there something else and then they suddenly become this other person? And how does it change their view of the world? And my main character in Ragman, Mac McRae, finds himself in a very difficult situation, and he does something that I won't elaborate on, but it's not what you expect, that suddenly causes him to become a person he had never imagined himself to be. And it causes him to see the world in a new and different way. And it actually, in a way, empowers him. He discovers that success in business is all but assured once you throw ethics and morality out the window, which is something that I think a lot of people in business have long suspected. There's one line in the book that's kind of the key line, and that is, think what you could do, think what you could accomplish if you didn't have to live with yourself.
Yeah, very true. Very, very true. A little bit about these. I'm just curious what you might be working on next. Now that you've got these out, I know they're just out, so it's probably too early to ask, but
No,
No?
we're dead into the next ones.
Yeah.
I've got the next book in the Claire Watkins series that tentatively is titled Bone Harvest. That
oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, I'm pretty deep
I like the
into.
title about
And
that.
it's going to have a historical component that I'm very excited about.
And my next book is called Doohickey, should be out in October 2002. And it's, now that I've written kind of a darker book, I'm going back in the other direction, and it's, as far as crime novels is concerned, it's kind of like light comic opera.
Are you reusing any of the same characters?
No.
No, it's
No,
brand new.
all new characters and a new setting too. I'm setting it in mostly in the Tucson, Arizona area.
Oh, so you're leaving the Twin Cities.
Well, in
And
fiction,
coming back,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, you both did that and
Yeah,
came back. I'm very
yeah.
glad to see that. Speaking of book titles, I remember reading in various places that at one time or another you were working on a book that was titled Bitter Sugar and one that was called Black Ice, I think.
Yes,
Whatever
yeah.
happened to those, or did they evolve into...
Parts of them, but Bitter Sugar actually was the second book in a series that I wasn't able to continue with Seal Press. And,
that would be the Laura Malloy
right,
follow-on to
right,
Still
right.
Explosion.
And Black Ice was a standalone that I might have to go back to.
Well, that
Yeah.
both sound very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, our time has run very quickly out. I'm sorry to say there's much more to talk about. I want to thank you both very much for being our guest today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Yep.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.